In this video, we'll talk about some of the more difficult sentence corrections that you might encounter on the verbal section of the executive assessment, those with very long underlines. So these are roughly a quarter to a third of the sentence corrections that you'll encounter in the verbal section. They're not necessarily more or less difficult than other sentence corrections, and they are sometimes deployed as part of a verbal section harder second half, but the main area of difficulty is just that there's a longer sentence to read, to be perfectly honest. Now, our strategic implications, you do still have to maintain your overall minute 30 average per sentence correction and a 2-minute maximum even for these longer sentence corrections. Because we want the sentence correction approach to be a more visual based endeavor, you shouldn't have to reread these sentences over and over again. You're just going to be scanning the answer choices and trying to visually identify differences in the answer choices and adjudicate them based on their technical meaning as opposed to listening for 5 different options. Do allow a maximum of a single reread before choosing to eliminate guess and move on. And that should happen when you're working through the answer choices. If you need to evaluate between two, at that point, reread. But remember, again, with sentence corrections, there should be basically one read at the beginning to try to identify an error, and then one read at the end to determine whether or not your answer introduces new issues of meaning. But if you need to, you've got one more reread as a maximum for these long underlines, but you have to beware of just rereading it over and over and over again, because that's a real quick way to throw off your pacing for the whole half. Now, do focus on the intended meaning to note logical incoherency in the original sentences written. Oftentimes, there's some sort of confusion or mix-up in the intended meaning in these longer underlines, so you want to make sure that you're actually thinking about what it's trying to say as opposed to just looking to grammar auto-match. You also want to consider the biggest and smallest common errors in the choices. And that's often going to be misplaced modifying phrases, so descriptors that can be relatively long, and that would be the biggest error, just physically, and just missing or incorrectly matching pronouns and articles, because those can be as simple as just the letter A, because A indicates a singular, non-specific item. And if you note those pronoun and article changes, you can often kind of cut these long underlined sentence corrections down to size and eliminate based on a very minute detail that you might have missed otherwise. So we have a sample sentence correction here, relatively long, right? So you will want to read the original sentence as written, noting intended meaning and potential top 3 issues. So that's going to be your subject-verb agreement, your verb tense, and pronouns and articles. You want to use the non-underlined portion, if there is one, to inform issues affecting the underlined portion. And remember that, as always, choice A is the same as the original sentence. You want to also make sure you focus on one issue at a time to simplify your evaluation of these long underlines and avoid fully rereading each choice as you go. So let's take a look at this here. So always attempt to proactively identify the main actor or subject in the sentence is written to confirm proper subject-verb agreement as a first step, because we know that all sentences have to have a subject that matches its verb. Remember that generally one in the pair is going to conclude an S, and make sure that that main subject connects to a main verb to create a complete sentence as written. In this case, we've got maize. And if we read through the sentence, we've got in the maize-deficient regions in the north, maize, still importantly, making up a smaller share of food intake, so households in these regions supplement maize with other starchy staples such as cassava and banana. There's no main verb here. So the original is actually a fragment, and it's really hard to identify that potentially up front. And that is definitely an error that you can work through if you recognize that this is a fragment. But let's say that you didn't identify that initial issue of, hey, this actually isn't even a sentence at all, even though it's really long in terms of the underline. If you can't identify an error in the long underlines, and these ones do tend to just have a higher level difficulty of identifying the error up front because there's just so much that's underlined, it can be a little bit overwhelming, then seek 2-3 splits in the choices that inform possible issues to evaluate. And in this case, we can see that we've got 3 options that are in the north, and we've got 2 options that start with while still important. And so we can try to just adjudicate which is going to be the correct answer here, whether it should be in the north immediately before maize or while still important immediately before maize. So we've got to focus on the details to determine which phrase is properly ordered in the sentence to describe the information as it's intended. And the original meaning says in the maize deficient regions in the north, maize, which is in those regions in the north, right? Well, if we switch out to while still important, it changes the original meaning. Instead, we've got food intake in the north in choice B and food intake in the north in choice D. So both of those are out for this one, again, relatively long, like physically and visually issue of moving that in the north around. But that is a definitive incorrect modifier issue. So now you can also recognize that these long sentences often have multiple issues to evaluate in each choice. It's just the facts. So don't feel like you got to deal with one difference. If you can't determine whether one choice is better than another for one difference, seek another issue instead. There's another 2-3 split here. We've got cassava versus cassavas at the very end of each of the answer choices. And we have to use the non-underlined sentence to identify the correct match. And in this case, we discover that we are saying such as cassava and banana, which means that it has to be the singular cassava, not the plural cassavas. And that allows us to eliminate choices B and E. So through all of these evaluations, we've been able to eliminate everything. And we take choice C and we just have to read it back into the original. And we say, in the maize deficient regions in the north, maize, while still important, makes up a smaller share of food intake. So households in these regions supplement maize with other starchy staples such as cassava and banana. And that is the intended meaning of the original while not introducing any new errors. So there's a lot happening in these longer underlined sentences, but recognize that you have potentially more opportunities to get it right because there are multiple things that are happening within the sentence and the underline. So let's talk about our process. Step one, you need to deliberately read the full sentence while attempting to identify and articulate a common error in the original as written, as always. And if you identify an error, stop, eliminate choice A, and move to the next step. So step two, if an error is identified, eliminate A and any other choices repeating the category of error. But if no error is identified, keep choice A and seek small differences in the remaining choices to identify other common errors as reasons to eliminate. For step three, you need to keep evaluating those choices for certain specific errors, possibly using those 2-3 splits to help minimize the amount of things you're looking at on the screen with these long underlines until only one choice remains potentially error-free. And then step four, as always, read your selection back into the sentence to ensure it captures the intended meaning of that original sentence. So if you follow these steps, the long underlines will get cut down to size and not be as intimidating when you find them on the executive assessment exam. So let's go on over to the whiteboard, see how to work through this process live with an example. So we have a really long underline here. And as always, we'll set up our scratch pad with the answer choices for process of elimination, along with the line over top for any issues that we may identify in the sentence as it's written or potentially some of the answer choices. So I will have to work through this initial lengthy sentence as it's written. So, held for the first time ever in Alaska, the Western Forest Insect Work Conference. Okay, so the conference is held for the first time ever in Alaska. That's an okay modifier. We just consider it, and that works out fine. This conference hosted entomologists and forest health specialists from universities and private industry across the Western United States and Canada. Okay, so it hosted these people. And again, there's nothing wrong with that as it's written. Now, these experts, particularly interested in several breakout sessions with an Alaska focus, including 2 sessions on spruce beetles. There are a ton of modifying phrases here, but I don't see any that are wrong at the outset. But I'm still going to write as my possible issue modifiers because I know that by moving all of these modifying phrases around, they're probably introducing possible issues that I need to evaluate. But I might decide to not go through everything in my answer choices. Instead, focus on small differences. So I can see that I keep on changing um, my introductory phrase, but that's not that easy to evaluate. So I'm going to just skim and see what is the easiest thing to identify as an incorrect issue. And I remember that pronouns and articles are often that. So I'm going to just skim choice B and see if I can identify a pronoun or article that might be out of place. So we've got the conference held in Alaska and hosted and da 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 da, but I found a they. Okay, so let's go just track this back. Who are they? So there was no they in the original. And so they were particularly interested in several breakout sessions. I know that that's supposed to be the experts. But if we have this they as it's written in choice B, we've got hosted entomologists and forest health specialists from Western United States. And that doesn't even say the anymore. So there's another article issue that's really hard to find. But there's no the. So I've definitely got some pronouns and articles that I can focus on as opposed to the modifiers. So we're going to have pronouns and articles as the categorical issue. I'm just going to skim for in my remaining answer choices. So in choice C, I've got interesting them. And who is them? Well, again, I don't know who them is, right? I've got universities, and that's the closest possible plural subject, and it's supposed to be the experts. So I can eliminate choice C without rereading that whole thing, which is kind of the entire goal of this approach. So then choice D, I'm again just skimming for pronouns and articles rather than trying to place these modifiers in the right order. So going through, I've got another them here in choice D. So interesting them. And I track back to what them is. And the nearest is the universities. And again, I need it to be the experts from the original sentence. So choice D is out too for just this one categorical issue of pronouns and articles. And lo and behold, if I go to E, I can actually find the them way at the end. And we see that them is referring back to the Beatles. And that's certainly not what we're supposed to be articulating here. And so, again, you can see I don't read the whole sentence for each of these choices. I'm looking for small details, and I do track the original to make sure all of my modifications are correct. And if choice A is the right answer, I may decide not to reread the original because I didn't find an error as it were written. But if you feel the need to, absolutely feel free to guarantee that this is correct if you're under 2 minutes for the entire process. So go ahead and work through some practice sentence corrections, and I'm sure you'll find some long underlines like these to hopefully better understand how to not waste time reading and listening to everything that's written down and instead looking for small issues to cut these longer underlines down to size.